It's China. Start off by saying this about the Chinese. The Chinese are the people who, until the year 1500, might have been the most inventive, creative people on the face of the earth, with a possible exception of the earlier peoples, the Sumerians and the Indus Valley peoples, who might have been more inventive than the Chinese. But the Chinese were possibly one of the biggest inventors. What all did they invent? Well, they invented porcelain, steel, silk, gunpowder, the rudder used on ships, the movable sail, up until about the year 1500, approximately that time period. They were the most inventive people on earth. But they only got so far with their inventions. They invented paper, paper money, banking. They only got so far with their inventions, and then it's like they stopped. We'll be visiting China 2 more times this semester, and I'll have more to say about their inventions and speculations on why they stopped. But in this earlier period, we won't go into that much detail about how far they got and why they didn't get any farther. Anyway, in the case of China, ancient history is a study of isolated pockets of humanity. Right here's one isolated pocket, here's another, here in the Middle East is another, here in Europe is another, North America was one, Central America was one, South America another, Sub-Saharan Africa another. You have these isolated pockets of humanity, Southeast Asia was another, that are kept isolated from each other by oceans, by mountains or deserts. In the case of China, there was a huge desert right here that kept them isolated from the rest of humanity, then another even worse desert right here, and then the tall Himalayan mountains that tended to separate India from China. And this terrain right here is fairly rugged terrain. So most of China's people, down through the ages, have lived in this region of China here, what is today Manchuria and China proper, with this area being much more sparsely populated. Only 12% of China's land is arable. Now, that word arable means capable of being farmed. Only about 12%, which means that China's population has tended to concentrate in small areas of China. Now, when I was a kid, China used to boast that we're the only country in the world that can survive a nuclear bomb. The problem with that was, though, that people were all concentrated in such a relatively small area of China, whereas the United States, our people are more scattered out, so we might have had a better chance in a nuclear war in those days than they did. Anyway, China had constant problems with Mongolians. The Mongolians were people who lived in this region here, and this region is far from the coastland and tends to be very, very dry. Now, every once in a while, the Mongolians have been forced to move from their homeland. Sometimes they've come down here to China like Genghis Khan did. Sometimes they've come to the Middle East like the Turks did. And sometimes like the Huns, the Magyars, and the Bulgars. I may have left a few out, but they've come into Europe itself, made the long trip, 10,000 mile long trip, and wound up in the eastern part of Europe. And again, we'll talk about all these migrations before the semester is out. But in the case of the Chinese, you have, the Chinese were civilized people surrounded by mostly uncivilized Mongolians, not surrounded, but they had Mongolians on one side. So, to keep the Mongolians at bay, they built the Great Wall. All right, the Great Wall of China, which is about 1,500 miles long. And you may think, well, couldn't the Mongolians have gone around it? Actually, the wall is built in such a way that if they try to go around it, they run into some rough terrain. So the Great Wall did a lot to keep the Mongolians from coming in. I mean, these people would come in, sneak on an unsuspecting village, take away everything they wanted, including your women and children, and then take off back to Mongolia before the Mongolian army would have time to move in and stop them. Now, I had a student at another college write a paper on this, saying that the Chinese, instead of building the Great Wall, they should have simply trained an army. That's easy to say in the year 2015, when we have radios, cell phones, global positioning systems, satellite tracking systems, and helicopters, and night vision, where we know where everybody is on the globe. I mean, everybody who's outside, we can pretty well pinpoint where they are. I mean, in those days, they didn't have any of this. So they had a difficult time knowing where the Mongolians were, and the Mongolians were, after all, fast movers. So the wall was really probably the best solution they had. Over here in Britain, Hadrian built a wall also to keep the Scots out, and the Welsh and the Scots from invading. Anyway, the Great Wall is one of the wonders of the world. It was once said you can see it from the moon, but they asked some astronauts who went there and looked up back at Earth, do you see the Great Wall of China? No. You could if it were 1,500 miles square, but it's 1,500 miles long and narrow, and it's just too narrow to be seen from the moon. Otherwise, it was once said it was the only man-made object that could. We now know hardly. Anyway, the Great Wall was put up to keep the Mongolians at bay. Chinese civilization, like the others, started on the banks of rivers. The two rivers are the Yellow and the Yangtze. Now, as granted, some of you may know, we have a river right nearby here. It's just a short drive away called the Yellow River. But the Yellow River we have is just a small creek. It's partially yellow in color. That's why it's called the Yellow River. Nothing like the big river in China, which is navigable by some fairly large boats. Eventually, the Chinese joined these two rivers by a canal called the Grand Canal, and put these two rivers together. You know, here's the Yangtze and Yellow River. Two rivers that the Chinese began their cities along the banks of these rivers, as did most ancient peoples when starting their civilization. Hi. The Chinese society, all right, for the most part, down through the ages, it consisted of villages. There would be a village, then there would be an area of several acres of farmland. Then maybe just over the horizon would be another village, then a few acres of farmland, then another village. These villages, the family life consisted of extended families. Sometimes called clans. You were considered part of the same family if you were descended from the same great-great-grandfather on your father's line. In other words, your father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. If you were descended from the same great-great-grandparents, you were considered family. And the purpose of having these extended families was because their main crop quickly became rice. And if any of you know anything about rice growing, and I know rice used to be grown near the eastern part of Georgia. I don't know if it still is or not, but rice is an extremely hard crop to grow and difficult to work. At some point, the rice has to be grown underwater, and to work it, you have to wade in the water where you run a risk of running into leeches, snakes, and maybe other unpleasant, and bend over double, and it is hard on a person's back. But it's difficult work, and it requires the efforts of a community to grow. But they became rice growers and have remained so to this day. Now, like the Egyptian language, And personally, folk, I've studied it a little bit, and I think that the Chinese had their origins right here close to Egypt and came across down through southern Arabia, India, or some of them came by different routes, but they wound up, a lot of them came from this area of Egypt and Palestine or Canaan. And a lot of their culture is like the Egyptians in it. Their writing is ideographic, that resembles Egyptian hieroglyphics, even though the symbols are not the same. I mean, if you can read Egyptian, that does not mean you can read Chinese, and a Chinese person cannot read Egyptian without a lot of training. But they had another thing in common in that their history was organized on the basis of their dynasties. But unlike the Egyptians who named their dynasties, the first dynasty, second, third, fourth, fifth, the Chinese actually named their dynasties after the family name. Now, as is the case of all ancient peoples, the Chinese started off their history with stories that they were not as mythological as other people. You know, they did involve a lot of dragons. But a lot of their earlier history is not believed by modern historians. Nevertheless, your book mentions it, so I will anyway. They started their history with the three sovereigns. Now, folk, if I were to ask you about three sovereigns on the test, don't try to name them because, number one, I don't know their names, and number two, I don't expect you to. But here's what I want you to remember about the three sovereigns. They are credited with having given the Chinese civilization. Supposedly they taught the Chinese how to work metal, how to plow, when to plow, how to use a calendar, and how to domesticate animals, how to plant crops, and gave the Chinese their written language, taught them to write. So these three sovereigns who ruled one after another, again, are not considered historical figures. But then after the three sovereigns comes another dynasty, and there's of all these dynasties, there's only one I'm going to ask you to learn the name of. There's the Xia dynasty. This is considered also prehistoric, which means that historians do not necessarily recognize that this dynasty existed, other than secondary sources. There's no real proof that the Xia dynasty existed. Then came the Shang dynasty. We know that they were real because we have found the palace of their kings. It was buried under a whole lot of rubble, as is the case of all ancient cities. These cities over time would become steeped in more and more dust and dirt, and there was nobody to sweep away the dust and dirt. Eventually, after 1,000 or so years, the dust and dirt completely covered them up. Anyway, we have excavated the Shang dynasty, and we found, among other things, that they used the bones apparently for divination. They would write on turtle shells, and some of their writing then has survived even down through the millennia, preserved, and we were able to read their writing. The Chinese language has not changed that much, even though the written Chinese has changed some over the last millennia or so, but we can read their writing. It appears that they use these bones to divine the will of the gods. Again, they believed, as did a lot of ancient peoples, that the spirit of the gods resided in animals, and they could kill an animal and look at its entrails, or in the Chinese, look at its bones, and by determining what hue or what color the bones were, they could determine if the gods wanted them to do this or do that or do the other. Again, this was typical of a lot of your ancient peoples. Now, there was another dynasty after the original Shang. Again, I'm not going to write it down, but I do want to mention it because they lasted 900 years. The Zhou dynasty, and again, if I'm mispronouncing it, my apologies. The Zhou dynasty lasted some 900 years. And here's the one thing I want you to remember. not for this test, it won't be on it, but it will be later. The Chinese emperors often dealt with a problem that was really, really common among the ancients. And that is the common of land finding its way into the hands of a few owners. What would happen is society would start out with each individual family owning its own plot of land, and they might all be fairly well even in size. Then the family patriarch might make some bad judgments in his finances, or might get hurt in battle, or might get a disease and be unable to work, and his wife might be forced to sell the land. And then another family would fall on misfortune. To make a long story short, after a few hundred years, all the land found its way into the hands of a very, very few rich landowners, and the poor found themselves landless, or they were reduced to peasantry, practically reduced to what we might call serfdom or slavery. Maybe, well, serfdom would be a better word. Slaves can be bought or sold, serfs can't, that's the difference. But they'd be reduced to poverty, and it was a hopeless type of poverty. Now, we have two things in our country that's prevented this from happening. I mean, we still have our very, very rich people, but we don't have our large landowners. And there are a couple reasons for this. Number one, we have credit terms to where a farmer, everybody wants to farm, everybody wants to buy land, for any, even if it's land to live on. He can take out a 30-year mortgage or a 20-year mortgage and make monthly payments on his mortgage, and after 20 or 30 years, it's all paid off. It's rare that a mortgage is all paid off, but it does happen sometimes. The average mortgage only lasts about 6 or 7 years, then the people pack up and move out, or they default on their loan or whatever. But at least there is a chance for a person to buy a plot of land. Well, the Chinese had no such easy terms. The other thing that we do in our country is we tax idle land really, really heavily. In other words, if you own a plot of land that you're not using, and the government finds out that you're not using the land, they're going to slap a high property tax on you. If you're a farmer, you better go to the courthouse and get a farmer's exemption. Or if you buy a house that has a little bit of land around it, well, just even if you buy a house with practically no land, you had better go get a homestead exemption, because if the government finds out that this house is not being lived in, they're going to tax the owner through the ceiling. Now, any of you know what I'm talking about, the homestead exemption? Maybe one that hardly anybody knows yet. Well, at least you can't say you haven't heard about it. But this way, it discourages people from buying up a whole lot of houses that they're not using. If they have a house you're not using, the best thing you do is quickly get rid of it. Or if you inherit some property you don't want to live on, the thing to do is get rid of it. But in those days, in ancient China, property, and as in the case of most old societies, property would find its way in the hands of a few owners, and then it would be up to the government to decide at some point, hey, all the land is owned by the wealthy and the poor are practically reduced to starvation. What should we do about it? And most of the time the solution would be to break the big farms up into smaller farms and just redistribute the land, take the land from the rich and redistribute it among the poor. And folk, as great as this idea may sound, throughout all of history, I cannot find one instance where it has ever actually worked. In Rome, they thought about it. They never actually did. In Greece, the Athenians thought about doing this. Never actually did. But the Koreans tried it. The Chinese have tried it several times. And even within the last 100 years, Mexico, a Mexican dictator, tried it. Some Latin American countries have tried it. The result is the poor people are never benefited, and the rich wind up soaking up all the land anyway, and the poor wind up defaulting. At least when the Russians freed their serfs in 1862, they gave the land to the former serfs, but on a 40-year loan, where the serfs had 40 years to pay for it. And believe it or not, that worked better than just outright giving them the land. Why does it not work? It's just basic human nature, socialism. What you're given is what you call come easy, go easy. Actually, I'm not sure that any of us knows why it doesn't work, but in general, it doesn't. Anyway, these dynasties would deal with this problem from time to time. Eventually, the Zhou dynasty, after hundreds of years, came to an end, 900 years. They developed Among other things, so while they're in power, they developed the use of iron plowshares, using iron to plow up the garden. And then they learned how to get more work out of a horse by by harnessing the horse, not to the horse's neck. You might feel for the horse who has to pull a plow with a yoke attached to his neck. Instead, they wound up putting the harness on the horse's shoulders, and that way the horse could pull a whole lot better load. The Chinese are credited, among their other inventions, with inventing the shoulder harness, which we might take for granted, but actually it was to be many, many generations later before Europeans learned about the shoulder harness, and they copied it from the Chinese. They invented the iron plow, invented the shoulder harness, and they also learned to let some of their farmland lie fallow. Now, again, I'm talking to a class of young people. Most of you might not have much of an idea what farming is like. My maternal grandfather was a farmer, and a lot of my uncles and aunts on the mother's side were farmers, so some of you might know. The word fallow here means letting the land sit idle for a year so that it will replenish its lost minerals and nutrients and become better productive the following year. Now today we don't have to do that so much because we have fertilizers that can put the minerals and nutrients back in the soil that we take out. But in those days, before they knew a lot about fertilizers, they realized they could farm land, farm half their land one year, and let this part lie fallow. The next year, they'd let this part lie fallow and farm this part. And then we go back and forth every other year, letting some of their land lie idle, knowing that it would be more productive after it sat uninhabited for a year. They also at this time, now folks, this is in your book calls it natural fertilizers, but I'm going to tell you just plain outright what natural fertilizers are. Natural fertilizers is a polite way of saying human waste. They used human waste as fertilizer, and they generally got good results with it. Now here in America, our farmers often will use animal waste to fertilize their gardens. We avoid using human waste. And again, one problem, if you've ever studied parasitology, which I know is not taught in the schools anymore, parasites can be spread by means of, I'll call it natural fertilizers, but human parasites can spread from one person to another that way. That is a problem that they had. But anyway, they developed natural fertilizers, which they still use. The Qin dynasty began to build the Great Wall. Now, about the Qin dynasty was started by a very, very powerful ruler. And this ruler, we found his palace, and in his burial chamber we found about, I believe, 6,000 terracotta figures. The average height of them was about 6 feet tall. No two of them were alike, indicating they were not made from the same mold. And I'm mentioning this because these terracotta figures at one point found their way into our own Atlanta Civic Center. Though I didn't go see them. Again, if I went to see everything that is available, I would not have time for much else. So, but I was aware that they were there. But these terracotta figures were supposedly the Chinese emperor's army and servants, which he expected would accompany him into the next life. At least he used terracotta figures, unlike some rulers in the ancient times who would, when they died, they would kill their servants, or somebody would kill their servants and kill a large part of their army so that their army would follow them into the next life. They gave their servants and their generals, and they gave them incentive to make sure their emperor lived a long time. Anyway, now, it shows that the Qin dynasty spent a lot of time preparing their kings for the afterlife. And again, folks, this reminds us of Egypt, where the Egyptians apparently spent a whole lot of money preparing their kings for a happy afterlife. Now, I'll have more to say about the afterlife toward the end of the lecture. All right, which takes us up to the one dynasty I do want you to remember, because we will be visiting this, and when we come to chapter 5, the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty lasted some 400 years, from about 200 BCE until about 200 CE. And that means that they were contemporary with the Romans over here. And your book winds up making a comparison of China under the Han and the Roman Empire. And there were some comparisons. Anyway, we're going to run into the Han Dynasty again. They set out to relieve the suffering of the Chinese peasants. And I can't say that they actually succeeded. Again, they had a lot of their rulers were what I would call socialistic. And well, maybe some of you are socialistic also. I mean, I'm sorry, socialism has been looked on as being a solution to mankind's economic ills, not just in recent times, not just since Karl Marx, or not just since the Fabian Society 150 years ago. Actually, the Chinese tried it from time to time. And notice I say they tried it from time. They tried and it wouldn't work. Then a few generations later, they'd forget that it had already been tried. They tried again. It didn't work. A few generations later, they'd forget that it had already failed twice, 3 times, 4 times, so they tried again. More than one member of the Han Dynasty tried solving China's problems through socialism, or socialistic means. The result was chaos and disaster. Now, during the Han era, there were some inventions made also. Among them, it's believed that the Chinese built 450-foot long sailing vessels out of wood. And if so, that is really a feat, but we do have at least one rudder. But they invented the rudder. You might wonder why it had not been invented before. Perhaps it hadn't been needed. They also invented fore and aft rigging. In other words, put more than one sail on their boat. And they invented movable sails. Now, any of you who are into sailboating might know how important movable sails are, but let's say, supposing the wind is blowing this way, and you want to go this way, how do you do it? Anybody know? You can. Say it.
Oh, I don't know. I'm guessing move your sail.
Yeah.
You tack against the wind.
You what?
Tack. You go crossways back.
I think what you're trying to is this what you mean, zigzag?
Yes.
You zigzag. And as you zig and zag, let's say this is your boat. You point the sail like this and go this way. Then when you're going this way, you change over and point the sail, let's see, this way. Yeah, well, not that, but somewhat at an angle. Yeah, at an angle. This way to catch the wind and move the wind at an angle. You zig and zag, and you can go against the wind. It's not necessarily as fast as going with the wind, but it can be done. Again, you have to have the ability to move your sails and the ability to turn your boat. Now, it is known, I mean, I saw a professor here who did a paper on it. It is known that Chinese sailors got all the way across the Pacific and came to California. But unlike the Europeans, they didn't stay. And again, the question, well, why didn't they stay in California? After all, California was such a beautiful land. It may be that a lot of the problem was, unlike the Europeans who only had 4,000 miles of ocean to cross, the Chinese had more than 8,000 miles of ocean to cross, and that might have been enough to keep them at home. It is suspected that Chinese navigators went all over the globe and mapped the whole world, but this has not been finally proven. But also, the Chinese had a tendency to develop and to get so far in development, and then along would come some philosopher, some emperor, and just stop the development cold. A lot of people, I mean, who haven't studied it, blame their emperors for them not advancing any farther. But persons who have studied say that a lot of the problem was Chinese philosophers. Now, and here, I want to interject a conversation I had with a young student right here at his school, I believe, something like 3 years ago. he was all upset at the Christians because the Christians had hampered scientific development, particularly Christian theologians that criticized Copernicus, criticized Galileo. I said, fine and dandy, it is true. The Christian church did hamper, but did not stop development in the West. But as you go to other parts of the world, you go to China, Chinese philosophers completely stopped development in China. Visit the Islamic world, and Islamic theologians completely stopped scientific endeavors. Again, because they were afraid that science and theology would conflict. A lot of Christians are afraid of the same thing, have been down through time. But in Europe, Christianity might have opposed, but Christianity did not stop scientific development. Very, very big difference. In other places, development would get so far, particularly most notoriously China, it gets so far and all of a sudden abruptly their development would come to an abrupt halt. Eventually an emperor came along who said that we're not going back to Africa, we're not going back to India, we're going to allow those big ships we built to rot. He was influenced though by his philosophers. We'll talk more about this later. Again, there have been many books written on what stopped the Chinese. All right, which takes us in the area of religion. It appears that originally they worshipped a god called Shang Di, and a lot of persons, and I've already mentioned it, I've noticed that D sounds like the Spanish Dios, or the Indian also had a god whose name ended with a D. They eventually, though, they looked on him as being the creator, the head god of all gods. But eventually they started looking on him as being too distant for them, and they're not as much interested in their affairs. So they eventually turned to worship of other spirits. But then you cannot really name, other than Shang Di, you cannot really name the god they worship, because they had a concept about the spiritual world. Basically, their idea was the spirit world was heaven. Now, heaven was not the place where the dead went, necessarily. Heaven was a place of the abode of the spirits. And unlike Europeans who believed in a personal God who had a name, or a personal God who was one and over all the others, heaven was a host of many, many nameless, unnamed deities, but they controlled the earth. When an emperor was put in power, it was because heaven had accepted him. If that emperor went haywire or went astray, then heaven would reject him. Dynasties were set up by heaven. In other words, heaven, again, very, very impersonal. Heaven determined a dynasty, when a dynasty rose, and heaven determined when the old dynasty fell and a new one began. Again, a very impersonal concept, to say the least. And these Far Eastern peoples, particularly the Chinese and Japanese, appear to have been, in some ways, the least religious people on the face of the earth. Now, they also had a belief in the Yang and Yin. Now, these words can be spelled in various ways. Yang, sun, Yin, the moon. They believed if they kept these two in balance, all would be well. Now, it reminds me somewhat of a modern medicine. Like if you go to a doctor saying, I'm feeling badly, the doctor might determine, well, you have a deficiency of iron, or you have a deficiency of something else. And he'll prescribe for you a medicine that will improve or restore what's deficient in your body, and hopefully restore you to normal health again. Again, they believed that the yin and yang must be kept in balance. Now, it did not just influence medicine, but the yin and yang influenced all of nature, all of heaven. Had a balance, a cosmic balance of one force or the other. One, I don't know what word to use other than force, but one part of the nature and another. And folk, it reminds me somewhat of let's say electricity, where you have two. You have a positive and a negative. And yes, I dabble a lot in electrical toys, electrical gadgetry. And many a time I put together a gadget, plugged it up, and then wondered why it didn't work. And then realized that maybe only the positive side was plugged in, and the negative side wasn't connected. When you only plug in one, like if you put a battery in your car and you only connect one cable, it might be the positive or the negative, don't connect the other one, your car is just as dead as if you didn't have a battery. Your electric outlets, you might know which is, the modern ones have 3 prongs, but there's 2 that carry the electricity, the third one is the ground, very important now. I mean, there was about 50 years ago, the federal government made those 3-prong outlets the law of the land. And some of the older buildings still have the 2-prong. But when a prong breaks, like I've seen many a time where that one of the prongs on our power cord would break, there's nothing to do with throw that cord away, replace the connector with a new prong that has the 2 prongs on it. You have to have 2 in order for it to work. Same with magnetism. You have a north and you have a south. Now, in the case of both electricity, and by the way, we now know electricity and magnetism are the same thing. In the case of both, you have a magnetic north. Oh yeah, here's one. Let's say, for instance, this black side is magnetic north, and this black is magnetic north. And I try to hook the 2 magnets together with a magnetic north to magnetic north. What's going to happen? So what? They'll repel each other. They don't like each other. You put them together, and you can push the one magnet away. They don't like each other. They repel. But now you connect the north to the south, and you have a connection. Now, granted, this is not a magnetic connection I just demonstrated, but all you think know that. North must be connected to the south. Same with electricity. You put 2 positive connections together, positive, you'll get no current flow. The positive must be connected to the negative in order to have a current flow. In other words, it reminds me somewhat of the yin and yang, the 2 forces of nature which they believed made up the universe. Very important. Again, this affected their medicine, their science. They also had a concept in their religion of, we don't have an exact translation of this word, but for D-A-O, the best English translation we have is way. Now, we're going to talk about a philosopher in a few minutes who believed that each person had his own law or his own way. And therefore, if we see someone behaving the way we don't behave, who are we to criticize it from? Because maybe that's his law or his way. Like my sergeant used to say in the Army, when someone got a step, I know you beat to a different drummer, but beat to the same drummer the rest of us march to. Different. The law was the way that you chose, or the way that you were somewhat ordained to travel. Not necessarily the way you chose, but perhaps the way you were ordained. And again, one of the philosophers will say that each person apparently had his own law or his own way. They also believed, again, keep this word in mind, I have more to say about it later, that when a person died, his next of kin or near of kin had to perform rituals to send that person on into the spirit world. Because if you didn't, this person would never leave the earth and would be coming back to you at bad times of the night or inconvenient times to haunt you as a ghost. So they wanted to make sure that when a person died, they performed the rituals to send this person on away from the earth into another world, into another existence. All right, this takes us up to their main philosopher for hundreds of years, Confucius. Now, during the course of their history, China would sometimes go through periods of prosperity and order, and then there usually be followed by periods of chaos. When people got tired of the chaos, they demanded some kind of order. Well, into this scenario, Confucius was born. He lived in the 300s before, with the Common Era. 300 was actually before 300 BCE, but in the 300s. And as was the case of so many sages, he went around from one wealthy person, one nobleman to another, trying to get himself sponsored. They had to find sponsors. I mean, this was true in Europe. Musicians, artisans would try to find a rich person who'd sponsor them. And some of the most famous ones had a difficult time. Make a long story short, Confucius never really found steady employment under a sponsor. Nevertheless, as is the case of so many of the great philosophers who were looked on as great, they were not honored that much while they were alive. They were mostly more highly honored after they were gone than they were while they were alive. And again, I can name several persons who would fit that category. People would say to each other, Confucius say, all right, what did Confucius teach? The main thing is he emphasized the practical. The real aspects of daily living. Now, what he did not emphasize, and I'm going to interject that here because we'll be talking more about Confucius. One thing he did not emphasize was the spiritual. There are persons who do not even know for sure if Confucius believed that there's a God or if Confucius had any belief in an afterlife. His teachings had nothing to do hardly with anything spiritual. It was all the earth, the practical, the reality, and even some people wondered if he were not an atheist. This, again, we cannot resolve. We can't go back and ask him, and his writings do not really come out plain and tell us. But he set up the way he believed the government should be run, among other things, and his teaching was followed by Chinese emperors, some more than others, but for the next, more than 2,000 years. Confucianism was to be the dominant religion of China until the year 1949 when the communists took over. And if you visit China today, there are many Chinese who believe that their country should go back to the teachings of Confucius, or say we were better off under Confucius. And the Chinese communists have been more open and more tolerant of Confucius today than they were when they first took over in the 1940s and early 1950s. He believed that everyone had his own Dao, that each person was to pick his, you might say, his pathway and live according to his own standards, even though, granted, I mean, there are some standards of living that some rules of life we all must abide by. But there are some rules that certain people choose to abide by and other people choose not to abide by. Confucius said, let the other fellow alone. If he doesn't abide by your rules, you abide by them yourself and don't worry about him. Each person had his own law or his own way. If you got yourself in harmony with the universe, not with heaven, not with God, but you get yourself in harmony with the universe, again, very materialistic, you'd prosper. The idea was get yourself in harmony with the universe. Now, unlike Hinduism and even Buddhism, he taught compassion. Something that these Indian religions lacked. He taught compassion for others. And the Chinese from his time to this have commended him for it. Now, he and Thomas Jefferson would have had one thing they really strongly agreed on. Both men believed that government came from the will of the people. Now, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that government rules by the consent of the governed. Now, this is a radical concept for some people because before Confucius' time, the Chinese had believed that government rules by the consent of heaven. Heaven determined government. But Confucius said, no, government is set up by people, and the people can, if the government does not meet the needs of the people can rise up and alter that government or abolish it. Again, I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson here, that it's the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. Confucius believed the same thing. Again, you may notice he's getting away from the spiritual more and more into the material. And about the same time, the Greeks were starting to do the same thing. Now, he believed that government officials should be appointed based on their ability and not on noble birth. He noticed that many a person who had a high government position, because they were born into it, would oftentimes have a son who was incapable of governing. He said, no, we should promote a man based on his ability, not because he was the firstborn of his father, even because his father was a high government official at all. This was to lead to the Chinese test, the system of tests that they would do that was to come later. The civil service, that's what I'm talking about, the civil service exam. Now, we'll not mention the civil service exam this time, but the next time we visit China, we'll run into that. The Chinese were the first people we know of to set up the civil service exam, and high test scores on the exam would determine whether or not you were qualified for a government position. And again, you might say, and I had a student say one time, well, hey, who's to say that getting a high test score qualifies you for a government job? You can ask that. It's okay. We don't know that it necessarily does. In fact, sometimes the higher a person is on tests, the less able he is to deal with ordinary people. But then again, how do you determine fitness for a government position? We believe that we can pick the best men by a popular vote, where the vote decides. But again, popular votes sometimes pick bad candidates also. It's difficult to know how to choose the best person for a government position. Now, anyway, again, his ideas were followed more or less for the next 2,300 or so years, up until the year 1949, when the communists took over and they tried to do away with Confucius, but Confucius is so ingrained in Chinese mentality, communists have wound up compromising with him. Now, one of Confucius's followers was Mencius. Mencius was a disciple of Confucius, and he taught that man is basically good. And all you have to do, if the government could give the people what they like, there'd be peace and harmony. The government ruled for the people, give the people what they want. Sometimes I've been called opinionated, sometimes I've been sort of opinion. Folks, sometimes it's just impossible. I mean, to give the people what they even need. I mean, sometimes you have situations outside of your control. You might have a big enemy invading and you have to meet that challenge. Or there are years when the crops fail, when rains don't come. I mean, all kinds of disasters can happen, and the government just can't give. But he was speaking, well, basically, the basic idea is the government give the people what they want, and sometimes such a government will appear soft and encourage rebellion. And folk, I've noticed when I was in teaching public schools, sometimes the harshest, meanest teachers were the ones who were the best liked by their pupils, and the mild Americans were the ones hated the most. I could speculate all kinds of ways why that might be. But folks, sometimes it's that way. Anyway, he believed that man was basically good. Now, however, not everyone agreed with that. This particular teaching had no founder. But many a Chinese emperor would start off following Mencius and find out, hey, it doesn't work. So they resort to legalism. Legalism says that man is evil. And it's the duty of the government to check and to correct its evil. That we have a group of people out there, a sea of mass of humanity, and every one of them is just bent on doing wrong. So the solution to the problem is for the government to step in and correct the problem and force people to do right. Jailing those who do wrong, fining those who do wrong, and then encouraging people that way to do right. Government should rule by law. The law should be very strict. And again, a lot of your Chinese emperors wound up resorting to legalism. I want to pause and elaborate on that a little bit. That word legalism is, when I was in high school, we call like a toned word, an emotionally toned word. You probably are not familiar with the term, but it does ring a strong bell with me. On a very personal note, I grew up with legalism. Here's what I see in legalistic people. They are always critical. They're always finding fault with the other person. And furthermore, when they get together, they can't agree because each one of them is keeping a different set of rules. One of them says, well, I don't smoke. Another one says, well, I do. One of them says, I don't go to movies. They're evil. Another one says, well, I do. One of them, well, I don't watch television. And, they each of them have a different set of rules that they abide by. And they can never agree fully on a set of rules. So they're always at odds with each other, always critical of each other. I mean, have any of you ran into persons, maybe you haven't, maybe you haven't experienced some of the things I have, but legalistic people, cutting other people down, trying to make themselves sound better than others. Well, because I don't do this, I'm better than you. But the others, yeah, but then again, you do that and I don't, so I'm better than you. But they try to live their lives by a set of rules. And the worst part of it is, they want to enforce these rules on other people. And that's what separates the legalists from others. Now, maybe I went too far the other way, but I will say, having grown up under legalism, it's been about 7 or 8 years ago, but one of my children said, and I took this as a compliment, we don't have any rules around here. Hey, folks, in my own life, I think I abide by a whole lot of life's rules. And I think my children do too, but I don't see them as being rules. I mean, if you know what I mean. Well, for instance, 2 men were told by their boss they had to stay over one day and work late. They both got on the phone and called their wives, telling them they'd be late getting home. So one man called his wife because he had to. The other man called his wife because he wanted to. Do you begin to see the difference, folk? If you don't smoke, and hopefully none of you, is it because that somebody held a club over you and made you say, I'll whip the tar out of you if you smoke, or is it because you chose not to? There is a difference, a huge difference. The one person is under bondage, the other person is free. Now let me tell you about smoking. If you start taking a tobacco stick in your mouth, lighting it up, you'll soon be under bondage pretty fast. And tell me it's the hardest habit in the world to get rid of. And I've talked to several persons who have tried. And Lockheed, I hear someone say, come spring, I'm going to quit smoking. Why don't you quit now? Well, just too much effort. Now, down the road a bit, I'll quit. But again, now, a lot of religions try to enforce the rules like our government decree. I think, I say freely on it doesn't work. The life's rules are better off if kept because you choose to, not because some government is standing over your big stick. I'll have a lot more to say about this, folks, when we come to chapter 7. In case you don't know it, that's a chapter on this. Again, they believe that it's up to the government to enforce life's rules. I can't agree with them less. All right, legalism says man is basically evil. Now, into this scenario also stepped a different religion called Taoism, sometimes Taoism. Again, you see that word Tao here. It's sometimes called Taoism. The difference between Confucius and Mencius and even the legalist and Tao was This religion answered the needs of a lot of Chinese people who felt like their religion was not spiritual enough. It emphasized the spiritual more than the others. In fact, some people have associated with magic. The Taoists have made some attempts to convert a lot of Americans, and 20 and 30 years ago, I used to every year or so receive a letter from the Taoists, and they would try to convince me to join up with them. And they would talk about visiting this monastery, where that everybody in the monastery, these men all looked like they're in their teens and 20s. They asked me how old they were. Oh, we're 125, 130 years old. Well, how do you still look like you're in your 20s? I asked a Chinese man about this one time, and he said, yeah, the problem with them is when you ask them to document their birth, none of them can show birth certificates. They cannot actually document. But they will claim that they're 120 and 130 years old, and they claim they achieved this long, youthful life by proper diet, proper meditation, and proper sexual technique. Three things that go together and give a person a really long life. They call their religion science, even though hardly any Western scientist would consider them science. They are more associated with magic. In fact, during the Middle Ages, Europeans were dimly aware of China, and they tended to look on China as being a land of magic because the works of the Taoists even dimly, faintly reached Europe. Again, we don't know of any Chinese person who went to Europe, but China was somewhat connected to Europe through traders. A trader would go so far and give his goods to another, and eventually some Chinese goods, particularly silk, reached Europe. And next time we visit China, we'll talk about the Silk Road that gave a lot of Chinese goods to the Europeans and vice versa. Magic, spirituality seem to be the way of the Taoists. Now, supposedly, this story a lot of people don't accept to be true, but the founder of Taoism, whose name I can't recall, but anyway, and Confucius met each other one day. They met on a snowy day, and they tried to talk to each other and harmonize, but they were so different they could not understand each other. Finally, the Taoist founder went out into the snow and disappeared, was never heard from again. Confucius went on to found a new religion, but the Taoist writings were left behind where he and Confucius had met, and his writings were taken up by his followers and became one of China's bigger religions. Now, again, with the exception of Taoism, Chinese religions are sometimes called philosophies rather than religions. Necessity overrules spirituality. What matters is the practical, the real aspects, never mind the spiritual side of it, necessity. And some people believe that this emphasis on the practical propelled China to being the greatest civilization, but again, folks, I can't say enough. They got so far, and then they stopped. Stopped growing, stopped developing. Now, there was another problem with these religions, and this was even true of Taoism. None of them offered a whole lot of comfort to the bereaved. A young mother who lost an infant child to death found no solace or comfort in these religions. And except for the emperors, Chinese philosophy offered no assurance of any kind of an afterlife, happy or otherwise. This meant that it was not just in the case of a mother who lost an infant child, but even in the case of a grown person who lost a beloved brother or beloved sister, there was no assurance that they would ever see them again. In other words, death seemed to be the end for all except the emperors. And this was true among the Egyptians and even among the Greeks. The better people got to lead a happy afterlife. The ordinary people who couldn't afford to pay their way into a happy existence elsewhere got nothing. Now, among the Sumerians, I want to say this about an afterlife. Among the Sumerians, even the kings had nothing to look forward to. Gilgamesh was afraid of dying because he knew that death would mean that he would go to a clay netherworld where that there was nothing but clay, and all there would be to eat was a bunch of clay. And this was true for rich and poor alike. and nothing to wear but rags, and nothing around him but filth. This was all he had to look forward to in an afterlife. And Enkidu had caught a vision of the afterlife as he was dying, and this was what he saw: nothing but filth, nothing to be happy about, nothing to look forward to. And the reason I bring this up, folks, is one of the reasons Christianity was to spread and largely take over the Western world there was because it did offer a happy afterlife to its followers, something that the other ancient religions lacked. Okay, now I want to try something here. Let me see if I can get this to come on. If I can't, I'll have to do something else. We've got about 10 minutes. Is that coming on? No. Oh, it's trying to. All right. All right, it's there. Hopefully it'll brighten up a little bit. All right. Now, what these civilizations had in common, folk. Now, in this case, what I'm talking about, and folk, there will be at least one question about this on the test. I don't know if you'll get it or the class will. But what did they all have in common? Now, to me, the number one thing I can see that separated them from us was power was based on the ruler, the ability. In other words, whereas in our country, we follow a constitution, we have an election every 4 years, not because the president orders it, but because our constitution calls for it. Power is based on the constitution. The ancient peoples, among ancients, democracy was unknown, and this was true. Now, again, I'm talking about from the Sumerians all the way to the Chinese we just finished talking about. So this covers it all. Because normally, like I told you, I normally teach the first 3 chapters first and then give a test, but this time I decided to emphasize chapter 1. They did not have a document that we would call a constitution. Now, again, everything depended on the charisma or ability of the ruler. The ruler had to have a following and be able to lead, or the country would just simply fall apart. As a result, though, these civilizations would tend to rise for a while and then fade. Typically, you'd find people starting out as nomadic people. This was true of the Amorites, the Aryans, the nomadic people. They would come in, overthrow a more civilized civilization, more advanced civilization. Then they would wind up copying a lot of the culture of the people they conquered. Now, something that's, I was in the Army for a time, and one of the things they told you when it came time to salute an officer, they said, when you salute an officer, you are not saluting the man who's wearing the bars, or the man who's wearing the stars, or the maple leaf, or the man who's wearing the bird, colonel. You're saluting those bars. So you're saluting the bird. You're saluting the office he holds, not the man. The important thing is the office he holds, not the man who holds it. The ancient world, they had it opposite. The important thing was the man who held the office. And this is believed to be one of the things that destroyed the Roman Empire. Each office was held, well, they never defined what an office was. There'd be an office, and it'd be held by a man, and after a while that office would become a mere symbolic figurehead, and someone else who was holding another office would take over. They never defined what a real office was or how much power each officer was to have. And you might find an army where the captain sometimes had more authority and more men than the major. The major, how many men he had, depending on how many men he could collect, not what the army issued to him. Everything was dependent on the ability of the person, not the system.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Are you going to have this on iCollege?
This will not be on iCollege. In other words, hopefully I'm giving favors to those of you who are here.
Thanks.
Okay. This will not be on iCollege, no. These people were very, very religious. But there's a trend that you see in their gods. It goes down through time. They were polytheistic. Now, they may have all originally been monotheistic. That can be argued. But their favorite gods would tend to change over time. In other words, like the Greeks, well, I'll skip them until later, but the Sumerians, originally their god was An. Then it became Enki and Enlil. And oftentimes, a very minor god would eventually rise up the top. Now, when An was the supreme god, Nabu was way down at the bottom of the pantheon. But then as An faded from importance, as Enki and Enlil went out the window, Marduk went out the window, up to the top stepped Nabu, who had at one time been a minor deity. All of a sudden, he became the head of the pantheon. Their gods would tend to change over time. Skepticism, these people seems to have not had any skeptics among them until you come to the year 300 or so BCE. Then, among the Chinese and the Greeks, you wind up having religious skeptics. But until that time, now among the Greeks you also have democracy, and amongst some of the cities they have a constitution, which makes the Greeks more like us than anybody else. And we'll be talking more about Greek democracy and Roman democracy. And in the case of both, the democracies tended to end when a strong man took over, when chaos became too much for the people to handle. But skepticism seems to have not existed until late in Greek history, about the 300s. Their religion tended to be intertwined with magic, superstition, shamanism. This was not necessarily true among the upper classes, but among the lower, ordinary people. Now, human sacrifice, a lot of these societies had it. Magic has been described as the worst religion you can have. In it, it's the belief that I, myself, am in charge, and the gods are my slaves, and the gods do my bidding according to my whims. And I read a book one time that called this the very, very worst form of religion. Superstition, beliefs that you can appease the gods by certain rituals, carry around a rabbit's foot, find a four-leaf clover, nail a horseshoe to your doorpost or something. This will, the superstitious person, the same book, by the way, said the superstitious person wishes there were no gods, because the gods are often fickle and difficult to please. That is good. Shamanism, another word for shaman is witch doctor. Now, folk, I'm in no way advocating this, but the shamans will sometimes use a drug to go into a trance, and what they see in a trance-like state, they believe is a message from the spirit world. They'll come back and tell you what they saw while they're in a trance-like state. And some of the shamanistic cures that they have found are now believed by some doctors to have some medical validity. They can cure certain ailments and relieve certain types of injuries and pains. Again, I'm not saying it's all a bunch of fakery. Temple prostitution. Young people would prostitute themselves in the temple, and illegitimate babies born from these unions would be sacrificed in ovens much too often. Their religion, for the most part, had little to do with morality. The Jews and Persians were an exception, but the religion was completely separated from morals. The religions tended to be, if I can gain more than you, I'm better than you. Or if I have more than you, I'm better than the ideal life was to get all you could. Now, there was an exception. Buddhism said, no, get rid of life, of the things of life. Have no desire for the things of life. And everything you happiness depends on how much you could let go of. If I throw out my desires and have fewer desires than you, I'll experience less sorrow than you. Little. Again, I've already said this, but I'll repeat it. Little was promised in the way of a happy afterlife. Now, their life, I'm going to back up to the bottom. Their life was centered around the city, for the most part, and in the city was a temple. And most of the time, a lot of their life was centered around their temples. Their temples was where they got their education, offered their sacrifice, and met and assembled. Their art and music was religious. They were slave societies. And now, about a minute or two left, so I'll close with this, folks. About women. At every chapter, your authors will make a statement about the role of women in this society. And I do not know if your authors are aware that they're saying this or not. But I've read in every chapter, chapters 1 through 13, and actually on up even beyond that, the role of women in each society, and I've come to the conclusion, again, I don't know if your authors are aware of it, that the more equal the women were, hold on your seats, the more primitive the society was. Having said that, I'll quit for the day. If nothing about women, I'm married to one. I mean, I have 2 daughters, but when you make them equal, they won't stay equal. They'll take over and they'll run the show. And the result is often, when you make them, the result is often disastrous. I've had a couple of women in my life who tried to run my life. All right, with that, everybody have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday.